What was women's suffrage? Women's suffrage was a movement from 1848 to 1920 where women fought for the right to vote. The main leaders were Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a determined and resourceful organizer, Susan B. Anthony, a tenacious campaigner, and Alice Paul, a strong-willed reformist. Why was the suffrage movement so important in this country?
The suffrage movement was very important in this country because prior to the suffrage movement, women did not have the opportunity to generate or make the laws that they were subject to. And the laws that women were subject to were extremely unfair, shall we say. They were considered property of either their fathers or their husbands, and a woman with no father or no husband was particularly vulnerable to discrimination and abuse. So that's one reason why suffrage was extremely important.
This movement began in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Seneca Falls was a progressive town and was home to many abolitionists. It was at a meeting discussing women's rights that Elizabeth Cady Stanton first proposed the idea of women's suffrage. It was immediately shot down until Frederick Douglass stood up in support of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's idea. Shortly afterward, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Susan B. Anthony, and together they began their lifelong struggle for the right to vote. They formed the American Equal Rights Association in 1866, which then began the publication of the Revolution. Then the movement split, creating the National Women's Suffrage Association, which fought for an amendment to the Constitution, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, which worked on state-level voting rights. Both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were part of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Another large issue of this time was abolishing slavery. Until the Civil War, abolitionists and women suffragists worked together on both of their missions. Afterwards, they never joined forces again. Although black women participated in the American Equal Rights Association and later in both the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, many times African American women were discriminated against in these groups. In 1896, the National Association of Colored Women was formed. Many other solely African American groups were formed. African American and white suffrage associations worked side by side on the problem of women's right to vote. Who, in your opinion, was the most important suffrage leader and why?
Basically, my opinion is yes, it's a movement, and this is one of the problems in this country is we like to hold up, these are the leaders and these leaders made it happen. Mm-hmm. Well, the reality is the people made it happen, mm-hmm. and you had a wide group of people talking about it, agitating, literally, getting beat up in the streets as well as being arrested, and it took all of them. And so, yes, this country loves to say, these are the great people of history, but if you really look at history, look at mass movements and the power of wide groups of people to make change.
In 1872, Susan B. Anthony was arrested for civil disobedience after voting. In a speech given before she went on trial, Susan B. Anthony said, "The preamble of the federal Constitution says, 'We the people of the United States.' It was we, the people, not we, the white male citizens, nor we, the male citizens, but we, the whole people, who formed the Union. And we formed it, not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, not to half of ourselves and half of our posterity, but to the whole people, women as well as men." How do women continue to fight for equality today?
They come to the NOW office on Saturday mornings at 10 o'clock to work on the legislative platform. I think it's a daily struggle for most women, but at its core, and I think where NOW comes in, is being that daily activist, standing up for equality every step of the way. Making sure that you have equal access to education, equal access to employment, equal access to pay. You have a right to be safe in the streets. You have a right not to be abused or battered. And you have a right to health care that's fair. And struggling and fighting for those and confronting those injustices every single day.
The American Women's Suffrage Association continued working on the state-level voting rights, and in 1890, Wyoming became the first state with full women's suffrage. By 1896, 4 states had laws on women's suffrage. By 1912, 5 more states had been added to that list. This encouraged many suffragists within that group, but suffragists within the National Women's Suffrage Association felt that their progress on the constitutional amendment had come to a standstill. The change in the century brought changes within the movement. Young leaders joined older leaders and created the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Susan B. Anthony served as president from 1892 to 1900. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton died in 1902 and Susan B. Anthony died in 1906, the movement was in need of new leadership. Carrie Chapman headed the NAWSA from 1900 to 1904. In 1913, Alice Paul took over the committee in charge of the constitutional amendment. She and Lucy Burns organized a parade of 8,000 women in Washington, D.C., which took place the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Men in the crowds began to jeer at the marchers, and some even blocked their way and tried to stop them. When women asked police officers nearby to help them, the police officers responded by saying none of this would have happened if women had just stayed at home. Despite all these issues, the march was a large success in drawing attention to their cause. What are the goals of women's groups like now, today? How are these similar to suffrage, and how are they different?
I think the issues are the same. A lot of them are the same. You know, we've made progress, but we haven't achieved. But I think, the communications capabilities, ability to organize and reach people in a mass scale, like what Amy's suggesting is. But has really made a difference and made us more effective in a lot of ways.
After the march, Alice Paul split from the NAWSA and formed the Congressional Union. The Congressional Union continued to protest with marches and picketing, while the NAWSA, led by Carrie Chapman Catt, continued to push for state-by-state suffrage laws. How have the tactics women's groups used changed over time?
I also think that there's a phenomenon of, because we did win some earlier battles, that more educational opportunities are there, more employment opportunities in various fields are now available, and even, granted we still have problems with government, but the fact that we do have feminist activists that actually made it into government allows us to have different channels of power and tactics used for the movement that we just haven't had before. And so, granted, technology, huge change in how we're organizing, but also having role models to say, look, this is possible now. And these people are actually helping us out from the inside, and they're us, is huge. Because before that happens, you're hitting your head up against a brick wall, and the first one through is the one that's going to get beat up the most. But now that some of those walls, not all the walls have come down, but some of them have, it allows us different capabilities.
I think now, because of the advent of social media and the internet and everything that we're able to do on that end, that we have maybe a few more access points to people, especially when we're talking about, leaders in Congress and leaders in general. When the White House has a Twitter feed, you can go on there, and it may not make a huge difference at the end of the day, but if you're getting 1 million people on Twitter who are saying the same thing, someone's going to pay attention. Mm-hmm. And so I think the idea that we have a little bit more access, a few different channels to access people, I think, and to get news and information out and to spread, ideas, I think makes a big difference in terms of reaching as many people as we can.
During World War I, the NAWSA split their time between war efforts and suffrage efforts, while the Congressional Union picketed outside the White House, mocking the presidential speeches using his own quotes against him. Because of these actions, many of these protesters were arrested. 168 spent time in jail. While in jail, Alice Paul started a hunger strike, which spurred many of the other prisoners to start a hunger strike as well. How did radical leaders like Alice Paul influence the movement?
I think one of the any effective strategy that we have in making change in society involves both those people on what we would call the radical fringe, doing the movement and the pushing and the agitating and the demonstrating, going to jail, civil disobedience, those kinds of things. But we also need those people that are kind of on the inside, who are putting pressure on legislators. At the time of suffrage, it would have been putting pressure on legislators from respected, maybe more conservative folks, making it easier and guiding and pushing. Well, yeah, look what these people say you want us to do. Now that may be a little much, but we could do at least this much, And so eventually, you move people in the direction of change.
One of the largest opposers of the suffrage movement was the liquor companies. The liquor companies often grouped the WTCU with the suffrage movement. The WTCU pushed for prohibition, and the liquor companies believed that if women got the vote, they would vote for prohibition and their companies would go out of business. These liquor companies, along with other opposing groups, created cartoons, flyers, and advertisements trying to portray women as stupid and trying to convince people to vote against women's suffrage.
Put me upon an island where the girls are few. Put me amongst the most ferocious lions in the zoo. You can put me upon a treadmill and I'll never fret. But for pity's sake, don't put me near a suffragette.
Other groups that opposed women's suffrage include the Society of Women of Beacon Hill and the New York State Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, which printed the anti-suffragist newspaper. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was passed. This amendment made the sale and ownership of alcohol illegal. Prohibition in this country ended the opposition from liquor companies against the suffrage movement. How did women's suffrage influence women's involvement in government, and how else has it affected the world today?
In office, I think that an important thing is the power of women's vote. So the idea that in the last election in particular, young women were literally a force to be reckoned with. Their votes pretty much decided that Obama was going to be the winner of the election.
In 1919, Congress formally proposed the suffrage amendment, and in August 1920, it was ratified when Tennessee became the 36th state necessary for ratification. Over 70 years after Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony began their fight for women's right to vote, their goal was finally achieved. Although they didn't live to see this victory, the 19th Amendment was named the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in honor of her service to the cause. Why are you a member of NOW, and what does feminism and the right to vote mean to you?
I have been a member of NOW for a long time, and to me, the reason I give so much time and energy to Minnesota Now and just NOW in general is because it is an umbrella organization that addresses all the issues together and equally, as Gordy pointed out earlier. For me, I don't think you can tackle one without tackling them all.
Want equality for everyone. They don't want just women to be doing these awful things. They want everybody to be able to do what they want. The idea of being able to have all the choices and make whatever choice you want.
How does your organization encourage women to vote and be involved in their government?
We, one of our arms is a political action committee, and Gordy's actually our political action committee chair at the moment, and we rate candidates on how they line up their positions, how their positions line up with our positions, and then we get out that information to our members. So we provide that service for voting. Every communication we have is about some action that our members can take with regards to making change, and a lot of that is voting.
What challenges will my generation face coming up?
People feel like we've come this far, we're equal, we don't need these laws. But the reality is that that's not true. I mean, that's just the truth. I don't know if that's as blunt as it can be, but people talk about how when we had our first African American president, all of a sudden racism would disappear. That did not happen. We know that. And so the same can't be expected to happen even if we had a woman elected president. Let's hope so. That even that would not say that all of a sudden sexism is gone. If anything, I think sexism is one of those things. My dad actually said the other day, well, until he's like, pretty much if men and women exist, sexism will not go away. And I have a tendency to agree because I think that there's always going to be, I just think it's something that we're never going to truly get rid of it, but I think that we can do as much as we can to get rid of it. And I think that the big challenges are going to be a lot of the things that already exist that people are just, are saying that, well, we don't need these, people are equal, and as Beth said before, it's not about how I feel as an individual being equal, that I feel I am equal. It's about groups of people. It's about laws and policies that affect groups of people and how these things are going to be challenged and how they're going to change over the next few years.
In the 93 years since the 19th Amendment was made to the Constitution, women have made many advances and hopefully will continue to move forward with the help of the next generation.